but no change in the regime. As I say, in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, nothing. Too much of a police presence. Bahrain is particularly significant for two reasons. One reason, it hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the major military force in the region. The other, which is even more significant, is that Bahrain has it's a Sunni dictatorship, but it has a majority Shiite population, and it's right across the causeway from Saudi Arabia, eastern Saudi Arabia, which is largely Shiite and where most of the oil is. There's a kind of an accident of history and geography which has placed the bulk of the world's energy reserves at the northern end of the Persian Gulf, that region right there, which is overwhelmingly Shiite. And there's been a deep concern in planning sectors for a long time that there might end up being some kind of a Shiite alliance, independent of the West, which would control most of the world's oil. And that's why demonstrations in Bahrain are regarded as so sensitive. No calls for regime change there, certainly not Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Well, from the outset of the Second World War in 1939, Washington anticipated that the war would end with the United States in a position of overwhelming power. High-level State Department officials, foreign policy specialists, met in a group called the War Peace Studies Group right through the wartime years to lay out plans for the post-war world. The core notion was what they called a grand area that the U.S. was to dominate in the post-war world. That included, at a minimum, the entire Western Hemisphere, the entire Far East, and the former British Empire, which the U.S. was going to take over. That includes its Middle East energy resources. The British, I should say, were not entirely happy about this. There was actually a kind of a mini-war going on during the Second World War between the United States and Britain over who would control Saudi Arabia, the kind of jewel in the crown. Of course, the U.S. won the conflict. President Roosevelt declared Saudi Arabia vital for the defense of democracy and freedom. That allowed it to get Lend-Lease aid to sort of push the British aside and make sure the right people took it over. The British Foreign Office recognized ruefully that from now on the best they can hope for is to be junior partners of, that's their phrase, of the master. And so it's remained since. That's called a special relationship, technically. Well, that was the plan for the post-war world in the early years. It was assumed then that Germany would remain as a dominant European power. But as Russia began to grind down the Nazi armies after Stalingrad, grand area planning changed. The goals extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible. At the very least, its economic core in Western Europe. Within the grand area, I'm now quoting, the U.S. was to maintain unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy while ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its global designs. The words are worth remembering. They still apply. These careful wartime plans were very soon implemented. It was always recognized from the very beginning that Europe might choose to follow an independent course. It's capable of doing that. NATO was established in part, partially intended to counter that threat. It's interesting to see what happened as soon as the official pretext for NATO ended in 1989. Anyone who believed 50 years of propaganda would have concluded, okay, NATO will disappear. It was there to save Western Europe from the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes, no more NATO. Not exactly what happened. Rather, NATO was expanded immediately. It was expanded to the east in violation from verbal pledges to Gorbachev, which he was naive enough to believe. Since then, it's been extended even further. It's become a U.S.-run global intervention force, a very far-reaching scope. The scope actually was spelled out by NATO Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, who informed the NATO conference that, I'm quoting him, NATO troops have to guard pipelines that transport oil and gas that is directed for the West, and more generally, NATO must protect sea routes used by tankers and other crucial infrastructure of the energy system. That's everything, in other words. So that's NATO's job. Grand area has expanded, at least in intention. Grand area doctrines clearly license military intervention at will, and that conclusion has been repeatedly expressed, was probably articulated most clearly by the Clinton administration, which declared, I'm quoting it, that the U.S. has the right to use military force unilaterally to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, and must maintain huge military forces forward deployed in Europe and Asia in order to shape people's opinions about us and to shape events that will affect our livelihood and our security. And notice that goes well beyond the notorious Bush doctrine. For Clinton, it wasn't even necessary to concoct pretexts for military intervention. It's enough just to say our security and power depends on it. Clinton's pronouncements did not arouse much comment. Bush's led to a huge protest. The reason didn't have to do with content, it had to do with style. As I said, Clinton's position actually went further. But the Bush presentations were arrogant and dismissive. European leaders don't like to be told to their face, as they were, either you do what we say or you're irrelevant. They're perfectly happy to accept that conclusion, but it has to be said politely. And Clinton said it politely, so everyone was happy. And so it's one of the reasons for Obama's popularity. The same principles governed the invasion of Iraq. As the U.S. failure to impose its will in Iraq, it was becoming unmistakable. The initial goals of the invasion, the actual goals, could no longer be concealed behind pretty rhetoric. So the government began to express them. In November 2007, the White House issued what it called a Declaration of Principles concerning Iraq. It had 2 points. It demanded that U.S. forces must remain indefinitely in Iraq with the right to carry out military operations. And secondly, Iraq must privilege American investors. 2 months later, President Bush sharpened that. He informed Congress that he would reject any legislation that might limit the permanent stationing of U.S. armed forces in Iraq, or, and I'm quoting it, or that would interfere with United States control over the oil resources of Iraq. Those are the war aims. Forget the business about democracy promotion. These were demands, incidentally, that the U.S. had to abandon shortly after in the face of Iraqi resistance. It's quite an interesting story in itself. In Tunisia and Egypt, the first major centers of the uprising, and the ones where it's so far been most successful, the current popular uprising has indeed won impressive victories, but